Окинава. April 1945 года. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara sits in a limestone cave carved into the southern ridgeline of the island. He is 40 years old, senior operations officer of the 32nd Army, a man who graduated third in his class from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, spent 2 years studying at Fort Benning, Georgia, and returned home knowing more about American infantry doctrine than most American infantry officers. He has a notebook in front of him, a pencil, and outside the cave entrance, the sound of engines. Not aircraft engines, ground engines, dozens of them, moving in coordinated patterns across terrain that military doctrine said tanks could not cross. He writes, what Yahara writes over the next several weeks, observations, technical assessments, tactical analyses of American armored vehicles operating in conditions the Japanese High Command had publicly declared impossible, will eventually become one of the most precise enemy assessments produced by any Japanese officer during the Pacific War. Not because Yahara was a genius, because he was honest. He wrote what he actually saw, not what his superiors wanted to hear. And what he saw was this. The American tanks were not behaving the way the Japanese army had predicted they would. The landing doctrine was wrong, the anti-tank doctrine was wrong, and the intelligence assessments that had shaped Japanese defensive planning for 2 years were wrong in ways that were going to cost the 32nd Army everything it had. To understand what Yahara recorded and why the gap between Japanese predictions and American reality was so catastrophically wide, we need to go back. Not to Okinawa, not even to the Pacific. We need to go back to the moment when Japanese military planners first looked at American tanks and decided they already understood what they were dealing with. They didn't. Part 1. The intelligence that wasn't. In the summer of Sorokdadnovgoda, the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff circulated a classified assessment of American armored doctrine and equipment. The document ran to 47 pages. It referenced observed exercises, attaché reports from Washington, and technical data gleaned from published American military journals. It was thorough. It was professionally written, and its central conclusion was this. American tanks were infantry support weapons, optimized for European-style set-piece battle, and fundamentally unsuited to the kind of close-terrain, obstacle-dense combat that defined Pacific Island warfare. Stop and hold that conclusion for a moment, because everything that followed, every Japanese defensive plan, every anti-tank position, every calculation about where to place guns and how many rounds to stockpile, flowed directly from that single assessment. If the assessment was right, the Japanese defensive doctrine it produced was reasonable. If the assessment was wrong, the doctrine was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The assessment was wrong. But understanding why requires understanding what the Japanese military actually knew about American armor in 1941 году, and what they couldn't have known, and what they chose not to know. What they actually knew was limited but not negligible. Japanese military attachés in Washington had watched American armored maneuvers in Louisiana and the Carolinas in 1941 году, exercises that exposed real problems with American tank doctrine. The M3 Stuart light tank, which would be the primary American tank in early Pacific operations, weighed 12.5 tons and carried a 37mm main gun that Japanese analysts correctly assessed as marginal against anything heavier than light infantry fortifications. The M3 Grant medium tank, which the attachés also observed, was a transitional design with a hull-mounted 75mm gun in a limited traverse sponson, an awkward compromise that Japanese analysts, again correctly, identified as a stopgap rather than a final solution. So far, the analysis was sound. Where it broke down was in the extrapolation. because Japanese planners looked at these early war American tanks and concluded that they understood the trajectory. American armor was infantry support equipment. It would remain infantry support equipment. The M4 Sherman, which was already in production in 6000 Godoo, but had not yet been widely observed, would be more of the same. Bigger, perhaps, better armored, but conceptually identical. A vehicle designed to cross open European farmland behind infantry, not to storm contested beaches under fire, not to operate in the mud and coral and jungle of Pacific Islands. This was the first error. Not a factual error, but a conceptual one. The Japanese analysts looked at what American armor was and projected forward without adequately accounting for what American industrial capacity, American engineering culture, and American combat experience would make it become. The second error was more specific. Japanese planners dramatically underestimated the amphibious capability of American armored vehicles. The question of how tanks got from ships to shore, a question that sounds almost administrative, but is in fact one of the most technically demanding problems in military history, received remarkably little attention in the Pervov-Sedov assessment. The document noted that American tanks would require beaches with gradual gradients, firm substrate, and minimal surf. It noted that loading and unloading from conventional landing craft was slow, exposed, and vulnerable to fire. It noted that the improvised ramps and causeways used in early American amphibious exercises were fragile and frequently failed. All of this was true of American amphibious technique. What the assessment missed was the landing vehicle tracked, the LVT, the amphibious assault vehicle that would change everything. The LVT had been developed from a civilian rescue craft designed by Donald Roebling, a Florida engineer whose family had built the Brooklyn Bridge. Roebling's original vehicle, the Alligator, was designed to operate in the Florida Everglades. Shallow water, dense vegetation, soft substrate. The Marine Corps saw the concept and immediately understood its military potential. By the first military version, the LVT-1 was in limited production. By the LVT-2 and LVT-4 were coming off assembly lines in numbers that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. And by the LVT-A-4, the armored amphibian, carrying a 75mm howitzer in a rotating turret, existed in quantities sufficient to equip entire assault waves. Japanese intelligence did not adequately track this development. The LVT barely appears in the assessments circulated to Pacific Army commanders in 1943 году. When it does appear, it is described as a specialized vehicle of limited tactical utility, a phrase that tells you everything about the gap between what Japanese intelligence was observing and what was actually happening in American shipyards and training facilities. There was a third error, and it was arguably the most consequential. Japanese planners assumed that American tanks, even if they could get ashore, would be constrained by the same terrain limitations that constrained every other vehicle. Mud, coral, steep gradients, dense vegetation. These were the natural defenses that made Pacific Islands so formidable even before a single defensive position was constructed. Japanese defensive doctrine explicitly relied on terrain as the first line of anti-tank defense, the assumption being that American armor would bog down in the approaches, cluster at the few viable crossing points, and present concentrated targets to pre-positioned anti-tank guns. This assumption was not unreasonable, given what Japanese planners knew about the M3 Stuart and early LVT designs. It became catastrophically wrong when American engineers began systematically solving the terrain problem with bulldozers, pontoon causeways, coral fill operations, and the M4 Sherman's wider tracks and lower ground pressure. Meet Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Hayashi, 38 years old, staff officer, Imperial Japanese Army, assigned to the operations section of Southern Army Headquarters, in graduate of the Army War College. Before the war, he had spent 2 years in Manchuria studying Soviet armor doctrine. which meant he understood tanks better than most of his colleagues and understood what he didn't know better than almost any of them. In August of 1943 года, Hayashi wrote a private memorandum, not a formal staff document, a private memo, to a colleague at the General Staff in Tokyo. The memo has survived in fragmentary form in the post-war Japanese records compiled by American occupation authorities. In it, Hayashi wrote something that should have been obvious to everyone but apparently wasn't, that Japanese intelligence on American amphibious armor was, in his words, thin in the extreme, and that the assessments being circulated were based on observations of equipment that has been superseded and doctrine that has been revised. His memo was not acted on. Hayashi was not wrong. He was not listened to. And the gap between what Japanese planners believed about American tanks on beaches and what American tanks on beaches actually were continued to widen for another 2 years, until the gap became visible to everyone, recorded in notebooks in limestone caves, written in field reports soaked with the sweat of men who had spent weeks watching the machines they had been told couldn't operate in this terrain, operating in this terrain with extraordinary effectiveness. Part 2. What the Beaches Taught. Tarawa, November 1943 года. The battle for Bechio Island in the Tarawa Atoll lasted 76 hours. It killed nearly 1,000 American Marines and wounded another 2,300. It also killed virtually the entire Japanese garrison of approximately 4,600 men. By almost any measure, it was one of the most ferocious small-unit actions of the Pacific War, fought over an island roughly the size of the National Mall in Washington, D.C., against fortifications that the Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, had publicly declared could not be taken by 1,000,000 men in 100 years. Shibazaki was wrong. But he wasn't wrong about the fortifications. He was wrong about the tanks. The American assault on Beshio used 14 M4A2 Sherman tanks, medium tanks weighing 33 tons, with a 75mm main gun and frontal armor of 50mm. They were carried to the reef line in LCMs, landing craft mechanized, and most of them drowned before reaching the beach. The reef at Tarawa was wider and shallower than the assault planners had anticipated, the tidal prediction was wrong, and the LCMs grounded hundreds of meters from shore in water too deep for the tanks to wade. Of the 14 Shermans, only 4 reached the beach in the first assault wave. 2 were knocked out almost immediately by Japanese anti-tank guns. 2 survived and operated for the next several hours. Here is the key detail, and it's one that Japanese after-action reports seized on immediately. Those 2 surviving Shermans, 2 tanks out of 14, were decisive. Not important, decisive. They broke open 3 separate defensive positions that had stopped Marine infantry cold. They absorbed fire that would have killed hundreds of men. They created the momentum that allowed the assault to continue when it should, by any rational calculation, have failed. Japanese officers watching from the few surviving positions on Beshio recorded this with something between professional admiration and alarm. A fragment of a report attributed to a senior non-commissioned officer, the officer's name has not survived in accessible records, described the Shermans as moving without hesitation toward positions our men had been told would stop them. The report noted that the anti-tank guns available on Beshio, primarily Type 37 and Type 47 guns, firing 37 and 47mm rounds respectively, were able to penetrate the Sherman's side armor but struggled against the frontal plate, and that the Sherman's gun was capable of destroying any Japanese defensive structure on the island with a single round. Hold that observation. It will matter. The lesson Japanese planners took from Tarawa was not the one they needed. They looked at the battle and saw that most of the American tanks had failed to reach the beach, which was true. They concluded that the coral reef had functioned as an effective anti-tank barrier, which was partially true in the specific conditions of Tarawa's specific reef. They did not adequately account for the fact that 2 tanks, operating for a few hours, had been decisive. They did not ask what would happen when American engineers solved the reef problem. And they did not adequately reckon with what was already visible in the Tarawa after-action reports, that the Japanese anti-tank weapons available on the island were not reliably capable of killing Sherman tanks from the front. The Americans drew different lessons. They studied Tarawa with the kind of systematic institutional attention that the Japanese military, by 12-second Gode, was struggling to maintain. They noted the reef problem and began developing solutions. The LVT-A, armored amphibian that could cross the reef under its own power. The DUKW amphibious truck for logistics, and the pontoon causeway systems that could extend a viable path from ship to shore across almost any obstacle. They also noted the anti-tank gun problem from the other side. If Japanese 37 and 47 mm guns could penetrate Sherman's side armor, what did that mean for assault tactics? The answer, worked out over the next several months, was combined arms. Tanks operating with infantry close enough to protect the tanks from Japanese soldiers with demolition charges, and infantry operating close enough to tanks to use the tank's armor as cover. The symbiosis that would define American Pacific assault tactics for the rest of the war. Meet Sergeant First Class Raymond Orland Turney, 26 years old, from Terre Haute, Indiana. Before the war, a mechanic at a Ford dealership. Enlisted in 1941 году, assigned to the 2nd Armored Amphibian Battalion, Marine Corps. By the spring of 1944 года, Turney was an LVT-A4 commander, meaning he sat in the turret of a 31,000-pound amphibious vehicle, crossed open water under fire, drove up a beach, and then operated as a direct support weapon for infantry assault. Turney's vehicle, hull designation A-14, participated in the assault on Saipan in June of 1944 года. His after-action statement, recorded by a Marine Corps historian in 1946 году, describes the moment his LVT crossed the reef line at Saipan in terms that are worth reading carefully. "We came over the reef and the water went shallow fast," he said in the interview. "I could see the beach. I could see the tracers. I could see other vehicles burning on my left. I just kept moving. That's all you can do. Keep moving." Japanese defenders on Saipan recorded the same moment from the opposite direction. A fragment of a report from the 43rd Division, the primary Japanese formation defending Saipan's western beaches, describes the LVT-As crossing the reef as armored vehicles of a type not encountered in previous operations, capable of sustained movement through surf and over reef obstacles. The report notes, with visible alarm, that the standard anti-tank weapons available to the beach defense units, primarily the Type 1 47 mm gun, were effective against the LVT-A's lighter armor, but that the volume of vehicles crossing simultaneously exceeded the capacity of available gun positions to engage them all. This is the arithmetic problem that Japanese planners had not adequately solved. It wasn't just about whether a given anti-tank gun could penetrate a given vehicle. It was about whether you had enough guns, with enough ammunition, positioned correctly enough to stop enough vehicles before enough of them reached the beach and began operating against your infantry positions. At Saipan, the answer was no, and the Japanese after-action reports from Saipan say so, in language that is unusually direct for documents of this type. One assessment, written by an unidentified staff officer of the 31st Army and recovered after the battle, states, "The volume of armored vehicles employed in the assault exceeded the capacity of beach defense positions to engage. Anti-tank gun crews suffered severe attrition before the assault wave had fully landed. Subsequent waves encountered reduced resistance, allowing armored vehicles to penetrate inland at a rate that disrupted the planned defensive response. Read that again. That is a Japanese staff officer writing in real time, describing the failure of a defensive system that had been carefully designed and confidently deployed. He is not making excuses. He is doing forensics. He is writing down what happened because he knows that what happened needs to be understood. The question is whether anyone with the authority to act on it was reading. If this investigation is showing you something that doesn't appear in most accounts of the Pacific War, not the version built from American after-action reports and regimental histories, but the version that Japanese officers recorded when they were trying to understand why their anti-tank doctrine was failing in real time, press the like button. It keeps this kind of material visible, and it matters that it stays visible. Part 3. The Notebook in the Cave. Back to Yahara. Back to Okinawa. April 45 года. By the time American forces landed on Okinawa on April 1st, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War, involving approximately 183,000 troops and more than 1,500 ships. Colonel Yahara had spent months preparing the 32nd Army's defensive position. He had studied the lessons of Saipan, of Guam, of Peleliu, of Iwo Jima. He had read every available after-action report. He had done something that relatively few Japanese officers at his level had done. He had tried to build a defensive doctrine that reflected what American armor actually was, rather than what pre-war assessments had said it would be. His solution was to abandon the beaches. This is the most important single decision in the Okinawa campaign, and it flows directly from Yahara's analysis of what had happened at every previous island battle. The beach defense doctrine, the assumption that American forces could be stopped at the waterline, that the moment of maximum vulnerability was the moment of landing, had been tried and had failed consistently against American combined arms assault. The LVT waves crossed the reefs. The Sherman tanks came ashore. The naval gunfire and carrier aircraft suppressed the beach defenses long enough for the assault to establish a foothold. And once the foothold was established, Japanese forces that had concentrated on beach defense were exposed, fixed, and destroyed. Yahara's alternative was the Shuri Line, a series of deeply prepared defensive positions anchored on the island's central ridge system, kilometers inland from the beaches, in terrain that genuinely did constrain American armor. Not coral reef, not beach gradient. Actual terrain. Steep limestone ridges, narrow draws, reverse slopes that denied the Sherman's gun elevation, cave complexes that could absorb bombardment and remain functional, terrain where the Japanese anti-tank weapons, the Type 1 47mm gun, the Type 3 75mm gun, and the magnetic demolition charge carried by individual soldiers, had a genuine chance of working. The Americans landed on April 1st and met almost no resistance. This was not an accident. It was a decision. And the Americans, initially, did not understand it. The first days on Okinawa produced something that felt almost like a training exercise. The beaches were lightly defended. The LVT-As crossed the reef without significant opposition. The Sherman tanks came ashore in numbers that exceeded anything seen in previous Pacific operations. The 1st Marine Tank Battalion alone landed 46 M4A3 Shermans, including the new variant equipped with a flame projector replacing the bow machine gun, designated the M4A3R3, and known to Marine crews as the Zippo. The 7th Infantry Division's Tank Battalion added another 54 medium tanks. In the first 4 hours of the landing, American forces put more than 100 tanks ashore on Okinawa. 100 tanks. In 4 hours. On a beach that Japanese defensive doctrine had, as recently as 2007 300 Gaude, been assumed to be impassable for armor. Yahara watched from his cave. He noted the numbers. He noted the types. He noted the new variant, the flame tank, which he had not seen in previous operations, and which he correctly assessed as a weapon specifically designed to address the one genuine advantage the Japanese defensive system had retained: the cave complex. A Sherman tank's 75mm gun could not reliably destroy a cave position with direct fire. The Zippo, projecting burning napalm gel 60 meters into a cave entrance, could. He wrote it all down. His notebook from this period, portions of which were recovered and translated by American intelligence officers after the battle, and which Yahara himself referenced extensively in his post-war memoir, The Battle for Okinawa, published in Japanese in 1972 году, contains observations that are remarkable for their precision and, in retrospect, for their accuracy. On the Sherman tank specifically, Yahara wrote, "The M4 medium tank is more capable in difficult terrain than previous assessments indicated. The wide track and relatively low ground pressure allow operation in conditions that should theoretically preclude armored movement. The main gun is effective against all field fortifications. The vehicle is difficult to kill from the front with weapons available to infantry units." That last phrase, difficult to kill from the front with weapons available to infantry units. Write that down, because it is the core of the problem. It is what Japanese officers had been observing since Tarawa and recording since Saipan, and had never fully been able to solve. The Type 1 47mm gun, the best dedicated anti-tank weapon in the Japanese Army's Pacific inventory, could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at ranges under 200 meters in ideal conditions. But getting a Type 1 into a position where it had a 200-meter clear shot at a Sherman's front plate without being detected and destroyed by the tank's supporting infantry, or by the tank's own gun, was an operational problem that Japanese doctrine never adequately solved. The Type 3 75mm gun was better. It could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at longer ranges, but it was heavy, difficult to move, and existed in small numbers. On all of Okinawa, the 32nd Army had approximately 140 artillery pieces of all types capable of engaging armor effectively. The Americans landed more than 100 tanks on the first day. This is the arithmetic again, and Yahara understood it. What he also understood, and what makes his notebook remarkable, is that he understood it without despair. He was not writing a lament. He was writing an analysis. The Shuri Line could hold, he believed, not because Japanese anti-tank weapons could stop American tanks in open terrain, but because the terrain of the Shuri Line was not open. In the draws and reverse slopes and narrow corridors of the southern Okinawa Ridge system, the Sherman's mobility advantage was reduced. The infantry-tank coordination that made American combined arms so effective on open beaches became more difficult to maintain in close terrain. And the Japanese soldier, armed with a magnetic demolition charge and willing to use it at close range, was a genuine threat to any tank that became separated from its infantry support. He was right about some of this. The Shuri Line held for nearly 3 months. It cost the Americans 18,000 killed and wounded before it broke. He was also wrong about some of it. The Zippo tanks, operating with infantry, proved capable of reducing cave positions that Yahara had assessed as immune to direct fire. The M4A3, with its improved Ford GAA engine, had enough power to climb grades that previous Sherman variants could not manage. And the American logistical system, the capacity to replace tanks, ammunition, and crews faster than the Japanese could destroy them, was something that Yahara noted in his notebook but could not solve. The enemy's capacity for material replacement exceeds our capacity for material destruction, he wrote, in a sentence that might be the most precise summary of why Japan lost the Pacific War ever written by a Japanese officer. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Japanese officers recorded the failure of their anti-tank doctrine against American amphibious armor with precision, consistency, and, in the best cases, with the kind of honest analysis that should have driven doctrinal reform. From the fragments of the Baishio garrison's observations in 1943 году to Hayashi's private memorandum questioning the quality of Japanese armor intelligence, from the 43rd Division's Saipan report describing anti-tank positions overwhelmed by assault volume, to Yahara's notebook on Okinawa, the documentary record is clear. Japanese officers saw what was happening. Some of them understood what they were seeing, and they wrote it down. The question is why it didn't matter. The answer has several layers, and each one is worth examining separately. The first layer is structural. The Imperial Japanese Army's intelligence and doctrine cycle was not designed for the kind of rapid adaptation that the Pacific War demanded. Formal doctrine changes required approval through multiple levels of the General Staff. Lessons learned in one theater took months to propagate to other commands. The Saipan report describing anti-tank position saturation was written in July of 12,000 Goda. By the time its implications could have been incorporated into revised defensive planning for the next major operation was already underway. The institutional speed of the Japanese Army's learning cycle was slower than the pace at which American amphibious capability was improving. Stop and think about what that means. Not as an abstract institutional observation, as a concrete operational reality. Every time a Japanese defensive planner sat down to design an anti-tank position, he was working from assessments of American equipment that were, at minimum, 6 months old, and often a year or more out of date. The American tank he was planning to stop had already been superseded by a better version. The American amphibious technique he was designing against had already been revised. He was always, structurally, fighting the last battle. The second layer is the problem of institutional honesty. Japanese military culture in 1944 и 1945 годах was not hospitable to bad news. This is not a stereotype, it is documented in the records. Officers who submitted assessments describing American capabilities in accurate but alarming terms faced professional consequences. The pressure to frame reports optimistically, to emphasize what Japanese defensive systems could do rather than what they couldn't, was real and consistent. Hayashi's private memo, written privately, not submitted through formal channels, specifically because he knew what submitting it formally would mean for his career, is evidence of this pressure. The very fact that he wrote it privately tells you something important about the institutional environment in which he worked. Yahara was a partial exception to this pattern. His position as senior operations officer gave him some protection. His intellectual reputation gave him some credibility. And the sheer physical reality of watching American tanks operate on Okinawa made optimistic framing impossible, even for officers less honest than Yahara. But even Yahara, by 2,000 God, was operating in a system that had already foreclosed most of the options his analysis implied. The Shuri line was the right answer to the wrong question. The right answer to the right question: how do you stop American amphibious armor at scale with the resources available to Japan in the 2000 God, was, you don't. You can't. The math doesn't work. The third layer is the most important, and it returns us to the 2000 God assessment. The original error was not factual, it was conceptual. Japanese planners looked at American tanks and saw infantry support weapons. They were not wrong about what American tanks were in 1941 году. They were wrong about what American industrial capacity and engineering culture would make them into. They failed to ask the question that Yahara, watching Sherman tanks climb Okinawan ridges in 1945 году, clearly understood needed to have been asked. Not, what can this enemy do now? But, what will this enemy be able to do in 2 years? That question is harder. It requires imagination as well as observation. It requires the willingness to project forward into uncertainty rather than anchor on current evidence. And it requires, this is the most difficult part, the institutional willingness to act on uncomfortable projections, rather than wait for the comfortable evidence of current reality to become undeniable. By the time the evidence was undeniable, it was Okinawa. It was 100 tanks on the beach in 4 hours. It was the Zippo tanks burning out the cave positions that Yahara had spent months preparing. It was, the enemy's capacity for material replacement exceeds our capacity for material destruction. A sentence written by a brilliant, honest officer in a limestone cave. Too late to change anything. The biographies of the men in this story have brief, unequal endings. Saburo Hayashi survived the war. He spent the occupation years working with American historians on the official Japanese monograph series, a set of detailed histories of Japanese operations compiled by former Japanese officers under American supervision. He died in 79 Gadu at the age of 74. His private memo questioning Japanese armor intelligence has never been fully published. Raymond Orland Turney survived Saipan. He was wounded at Iwo Jima in February of 16,000 God, a fragment of a Japanese knee mortar round catching him in the left shoulder as his LVT-A crossed the beach. He was evacuated, recovered, and was not present at Okinawa. He returned to Terre Haute after the war and worked at a Ford dealership. Different dealership, same job, until 77 Wasmavagada. He gave one interview about his service in 77 Sedengad to a local newspaper. He described Saipan in 2 sentences. We went across the reef. The Japanese were ready for us, but there were too many of us. Hiromichi Yahara was one of a handful of senior 32nd Army officers to survive Okinawa. After the organized resistance ended in June of 16,000 God, he was captured while attempting to escape the island in civilian clothes. He spent 3 years as a prisoner of war. He wrote his memoir. He became a rice farmer in Kyushu. He died in Tisyacha Deviatsot Bashu Odnom Gadu at the age of 76. The notebook from the cave has not been found. What survives is what Yahara chose to include in his memoir 30 years later, and what American intelligence officers transcribed from the documents recovered after the battle. It is incomplete. It is probably the most complete record we have of what a Japanese officer saw when he watched American tanks on beaches and tried to understand, honestly, what he was seeing. What he saw was a system, not a collection of vehicles, not a set of weapons, a system, industrial, logistical, doctrinal, that produced armored capability faster than any available Japanese countermeasure could neutralize it. The tanks got better. The amphibious technique got better. The combined arms coordination got better. And the rate of improvement consistently exceeded the rate at which Japanese defensive doctrine could adapt. The enemy's capacity for material replacement exceeds our capacity for material destruction. Yahara wrote that sentence in a limestone cave on Okinawa in Tisyacha Deviatsot Sorokpyatam Gadu. He was 40 years old. He had spent his professional life studying warfare, including 2 years studying at the American Army's own school at Fort Benning. He understood, perhaps better than anyone in the 32nd Army, what he was facing. He built the best defense the available resources could build. He watched it fail, in the specific ways he had predicted it would fail, for the specific reasons he had identified. And then he wrote it down, clearly, without excuses, in a notebook that may be lost, in a cave that was destroyed, in a battle that killed 110,000 people. The honesty of that notebook, the willingness to record what was actually happening rather than what the system needed to believe was happening, is the most valuable thing in this story. Not because it changed the outcome. It didn't. But because it tells us something true about the gap between what we know and what we need to know, about the distance between the intelligence assessment and the reality it's supposed to describe, and about what it costs when that distance is never closed. Yahara climbed out of his cave in June of Soruk surrendered. Behind him, the Shuri line was rubble. In front of him, on the beach where 100 tanks had come ashore on a single morning 3 months earlier, American logistics ships were unloading supplies for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. He had seen it coming. He had written it down. He had been right about almost everything. It didn't matter. But the record of what he saw, that matters. It will keep mattering. Because the question he was trying to answer in that cave is the same question every military planner, every intelligence analyst, every institution that has to prep, or for a threat it hasn't yet faced, has to answer. Not, what can this enemy do now, but what will they be able to do when it counts? Japanese officers from Tarawa to Okinawa answered that question, in their notebooks and their reports and their private memos, with more honesty than their institutions could use. That is the final, irreducible fact of this investigation. The knowledge existed. The records were kept. The gap between what was known and what was acted on was not a failure of observation. It was a failure of listening. If this investigation gave you something, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the most dangerous intelligence failure is not the one where no one saw it coming. It's the one where someone wrote it down, clearly, in a notebook, and no one in a position to act on it ever read the page. The engines are still outside the cave entrance. Yahara can still hear them. He picks up his pencil. He writes,